This is Debbie Goldberg with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on HUD's proposed Small Area Fair Market Rent Rule. This webinar is co-sponsored by my organization along with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, or PRAC. So it's been great to work with this set of organizations on these issues, and we're really happy to have all of you here with us today. The idea for this webinar, or really briefing, grew out of a conversation at the Fair Housing Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, where we were talking about this proposed rule that HUD had put out for comment, and felt two things. One was that there were a lot of complexities to it that needed some working through, and two, that it was going to be really important for people in the field, in communities that would be affected by this rule, either directly or indirectly, to have the opportunity to hear about some of the details of how the proposed rule is structured, and also hear some of the considerations about things that might be changed to make the rule more effective. And so we decided that we would put together this webinar. Really what we wanted to do was a briefing, but we thought that it would be helpful for you all to be able to see some slides because some of the material is a little bit complicated. And so here we are today. So I just want to give you a heads up that will be a little less formal than you might encounter in some of the typical webinars that you have been on in the past, because we really want this to be a briefing and to give each of the presenters the opportunity to weigh in on a number of the points that we'll be talking about. So don't be surprised if you hear us passing the mic back and forth and people kind of weighing in a fairly informal fashion. Just a couple of housekeeping items. One is that when the webinar ends, we will be sending you a survey that is both an evaluation of the webinar itself, and we welcome your feedback, but also gives you the opportunity to let us know if you would be interested in signing on to a joint comment letter on these regs, which our organizations are hoping to be able to compile. We thought that might be of interest to some folks in the field whose time is short, but who would want to weigh in on this rule. So the survey is a way for you to let us know whether we should be in touch with you about a joint sign-on letter before the comment period ends. Second is that we really welcome your questions, and so I want to encourage you during the course of the webinar to use the question box that's on your toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Whenever there's something that comes up, a question that you have, please type it in there, send it in, and we will review those and pose them to the presenters once we get through the formal presentation part. We expect to have a fair amount of time at the end of this webinar for Q&A. So please take advantage of this opportunity because we have a great lineup of speakers today with a tremendous amount of expertise on these issues. So let me introduce those speakers to you, and then I'm going to turn over the microphone. We're going to hear first from Barbara Sard, who is the Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which she rejoined in 2011 after spending 18 months as a senior advisor on rental assistance to then HUD Secretary Sean Donovan. Barbara has been at the center for a long time. She's frequently cited in a variety of media outlets and has written extensively on welfare, homelessness, and housing issues, and perhaps most importantly for our webinar today, she's considered a leading expert on the Housing Voucher program, as well as rental assistance and issues at the intersection of housing policy and welfare policy. Our second speaker is going to be Amber Lee, who is an attorney and civil rights testing manager for the Center for Civil Rights at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, or NCRC. Amber is a graduate of American University's Washington College of Law and also has a master's in public policy from the AU School of Public Affairs. In the past, she worked in consumer protection at the AARP Foundation litigation and also as a student attorney for the Community and Economic Development Legal Clinic. Our other commenters will be Phil Tegler, who is the Executive Director of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, or PRAC, which is a civil rights policy organization based here in Washington, D.C. PRAC's mission is to promote research-based advocacy on structural inequality issues with a particular focus on the causes and consequences of housing and school segregation. SIL has written extensively on the application of civil rights law to housing and education policy, including a number of articles about housing mobility. And PRAC also helped to develop the website www.housingmobility.org, which collects best practices and stories of housing mobility participants. And then finally, we're going to hear from Ed Gramlich, who is a senior advisor at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and leads its efforts related to affordable housing regulations, including the National Housing Trust Fund, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Regulation, and now the Small Area Fair Market Rent Regulation. Ed has a long history of working on federal regulation, helping folks in the field understand and influence those regulations, and he now is the senior advisor to the CEO at the Low-Income Housing Coalition on their efforts related to affordable housing regulations. So those are our speakers. I actually want to make one last comment before I turn it over, which is that as we all talked about this rule, this proposed rule, it seemed to us that it was both timely and particularly important at this very moment for this reason, which is that HUD, as you all probably know, has fairly recently put out a final regulation on the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing provision of the Fair Housing Act. And that regulation, we hope, will be prompting folks in communities all across the country to think a little harder about the kinds of opportunities that voucher holders have and the kinds of neighborhoods that their vouchers will give them access to. As you'll hear from our speakers today, while the voucher program has had a lot of benefits and the idea behind it has a lot of promise, it hasn't always fulfilled that promise as much as we'd like to see in terms of giving a range of choices to voucher holders about where they can live. So what you'll learn today is a little bit more about the structure of the program, what some of those obstacles have been, and what the impact of these proposed rules will be. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Barbara to get us started. She's going to lay the foundation for us about how the fair market rent system works and why HUD is considering these changes. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Debbie, and welcome everyone. At the risk of telling some of you what you already know, we wanted to make sure that everyone understood the basics about how fair market rents affect voucher subsidies so that you can follow the nuances of the rest of this presentation. So in the Housing Choice Voucher program, tenants typically pay 30% of their adjusted income for rent and utilities. That's the minimum. That's the required payment. Then, in addition, if the rent and utility cost is above what's called the payment standard that the Public Housing Agency sets for each bedroom size, tenants have to pay that amount in addition to 30% of income. PHAs set payment standards based on fair market rent that HUD determines. They have discretion in what's called the basic range to go 10% below, down to 90% of the fair market rent, or 10% above, up to 110% of the fair market rent for their payment standards, and they can use different percentages for different bedroom sizes or different parts of their area. They can go higher or lower than the basic range if HUD approves a request from the PHA for an exception payment standard for all or part of the geographic area that the agency serves. The big picture point here is that if the fair market rent and the payment standard are too low, families may have trouble using their vouchers at all or may have to pay extra. And these problems are especially acute in higher opportunity communities, which is why the issue of fair market rent becomes a civil rights issue. Let me try to give you an example to make clear how these dynamics work. Assume, for simplicity, that the gross rent and utilities is $1,000 for an apartment, and the family's income is such that their required minimum payment, 30% of their income, is $300. And further, that the fair market rent that HUD sets in the area where the family lives is $950. So in that case, the Housing Authority can go as high as a payment standard of $1,045 a month. That's 110% of the fair market rent without bothering to get HUD approval. And with that payment standard and a rent of $1,000, the voucher subsidy for this family would be $700 a month. The formula there is that the subsidy is the lower of the gross rent, in this case $1,000, or the payment standard, in this case $1,045, minus the tenant contribution. So it's 1,000 minus 300 equals 700, and the tenant pays just the required, no extra. In contrast, if you had the same family, same rent, same FMR, but the Housing Authority chose the lower end of the basic range and set the payment standard at $855 a month, or 90% of the $950 HUD fair market rent, the voucher subsidy would be only $555 a month, because in this case, the lower of the gross rent or the payment standard is actually the payment standard of $855, which is well below the rent of $1,000. And $855 minus the tenant's contribution of $300 leaves a subsidy of only $555. That means that the family has to pay an extra $145 a month to meet the rent and utility costs on that unit. Obviously, that's a higher rent burden for the family, which may discourage them from making such a move and may make it harder for them to make ends meet. It also may alter the willingness of a landlord to rent to that family, figuring they're less reliable to make their payments. But in some cases, it could actually prevent the family from renting the unit at all. There's a statutory policy, which is called the 40% cap, that prohibits a family renting a new unit. So it could be a new family in the program or an existing family who moves to a new unit. They are not allowed to pay more than 40% of their adjusted income total for rent and utilities. If, in this case, a family with less than $13,350 in income would not be allowed to pay that much more, and then they couldn't rent the unit at all. So as I hope you can get from that example, as the fair market rent increases, the range of permissible payment standards, because it can only go 10% above or below, goes up, which expands choice. And if the payment standard, if the fair market rent goes down, similarly, payments would be lower, reducing choice. I am unable to move the slide.
Barbara, I moved it for you. Just be sure to click in the window and then use your arrow key if you have problems again.
I think my connection has been lost. I'll just speak from my slide, sorry. To understand the background of HUD's proposal, it's important first to understand that for some decades now, fair market rents have generally been set at the 40th percentile of recent mover, non-luxury, decent quality units in metropolitan areas or in non-metro counties. So the FMR is for the metro area as a whole. In the late 1990s, during the last Clinton administration, HUD and particularly the Office of Management and Budget wanted to modify housing voucher policy to expand access to better neighborhoods. The way the statute works, HUD has substantial discretion to set fair market rents, but the Housing Act sets limits on how much the payment standard can vary from the FMR. So HUD decided that to use its discretion to modify fair market rents. And in 2000, HUD established 50th percentile fair market rents rather than 40th percentile in a number of large metropolitan areas where they determined under a formula that voucher use was overly concentrated in a small portion of the geographic area. And that's equivalent to about a 7 to 8% increase in the payment standard. Generally, 50th percentile fair market rents have not worked to accomplish the goal of increasing choice, but they have been more expensive. Next slide. And in 2010, HUD began the process to determine if zip code-based fair market rents would be more effective than metro area FMRs. Setting fair market rents at the zip code level became possible with the advent of the American Community Survey, which provides sufficient data for recent mover rents at the zip code level, although not sufficient in smaller geographic areas such as census tracts. In 2010, HUD applied the small area FMRs that they devised to the Dallas area as part of a fair housing settlement with the Inclusive Community Project in the Dallas area. And they also began a small area fair market rent demonstration. But the results of that demonstration are not going to be available until 2017 or 2018. Last year, in 2015, HUD decided, as the evidence mounted that 50th percentile FMRs were ineffective, research that's linked in the resource list that we've provided, HUD decided to tackle some metro areas and apply small area FMRs as a replacement for 50th percentile fair market rents. And because with fair market rents at the zip code level, there was no longer a need to focus only on the largest metro areas, and HUD decided to re-examine how it determines that vouchers are overly concentrated in a small share of units. So Amber, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. So to address the inadequacies of the current 50th percentile policy, instead of using metro area-wide fair market rents to set payment standards, HUD's proposing to use small area fair market rents. And these small area fair market rents are set at individual zip code levels, and they will permit payment standards to be higher in high rent, low poverty areas and lower in low rent, high poverty areas. This won't be a change to the entire voucher program. HUD's proposed rule aims to target only areas where voucher concentration is most severe and where small area FMRs are most likely to be useful. The rule also aims to eliminate current program incentives for families to rent in poor, segregated neighborhoods. As Barbara mentioned, following a settlement in 2010, HUD mandated the use of small area fair market rents in Dallas. And since then, Dallas has seen voucher holders gaining access to neighborhoods with less crime and lower poverty. So to achieve this goal of targeting areas where voucher concentration is most severe and where small area fair market rents are most likely to be useful, HUD has developed a formula to narrow the scope of the rule. The implementation of small area FMRs will only be mandatory in areas that meet the following 3 criteria. First, the area must have at least 2,500 Housing Choice Voucher holders. The goal of this criterion is to avoid placing a regulatory burden on the smaller PHAs. Second, at least 20% of the rental units in the metropolitan FMR area must be located in zip codes where the small area FMR exceeds 110% of the metropolitan FMR. The goal of this criterion is to target areas where a significant number of rental units are unattainable by voucher holders, even if the PHA set their payment standard to the maximum of the basic range. Third, voucher holders must be 55% or more likely than renters in the general metropolitan area to live in a census tract with high poverty rate or in a concentrated area of low income. High poverty is defined as a census tract with a poverty rate of at least 25%. The concentrated areas of low income are defined as census tracts where more than 50% of the households with an income earn less than 60% of the area median income and are designated as qualified census tracts. The goal of this criterion is to ensure that voucher holders in areas selected for the small area fair market rents are more likely to live in poverty or other areas of concentrated low income than renters in general throughout the metropolitan area. Based on the formula in the proposed rule, 31 metro areas in 17 states would be required to use the small area fair market rents. This list might change based on if HUD adjusts the formula in its final rule or as HUD receives updated information on tenants and various area characteristic data. And Phil and Barbara are going to discuss areas for comment on this mandatory formula in the proposed rule.
Thank you, Amber. This is Phil Tegler. Looking at that list of cities that Amber just displayed, we were frankly surprised, given the purposes of the rule that were announced by HUD, at the omission of some of the most severely segregated metro areas in the country, places where voucher families with children are concentrated in a small area. We were also surprised at the inclusion of some parts of the country that do not have severe poverty concentration as part of their demographic profile, and also troubled in a sense, as we'll get to later in the webinar, by the inclusion of some places with very low vacancy rates, where the implementation of this rule could present a problem for some existing tenants. And for example, some of the cities excluded from the formula include places like Baltimore, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cleveland, Houston, upstate New York, highly segregated metros like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Kansas City, places where we might see on the list of the most highly segregated metros that aren't included here. Now, the reasons for this are complicated. We're not entirely sure. We think it may have something to do with the fact that racial segregation is not explicitly taken into account in the formula. Concentration of voucher families with young children, which is one of the part of the impetus for the rule, is not specifically targeted. But also the denominator of the formula that HUD uses looks at the concentration of rental units in the metro area. In our view, the concentration of rental units in the metro area is not an independent variable, but is highly correlated, or in fact tied to patterns of exclusionary zoning and other discriminatory practices in history in the metro area. So that may also be a reason why the formula does not target the areas we might expect. Now, we've been looking collectively at some different approaches to tweaking the formula. One thing that we're planning to suggest is to change that denominator to compare the concentration of vouchers in a region with the concentration of all housing units in the region, not just the rental units, which are sometimes more constrained than regular housing units. The Center on Budget has come up with some interesting proposals which are slightly different for targeting the places of most significant concentration. But whatever the formula that we all suggest is, I think it's important to stress in the comments that we should aim to have this initial implementation of the small area fair market rent system be targeted to the places of greatest need. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Barbara Sard for further comment.
Thank you, Phil. We have draft comments available, and there will be, I believe, our email addresses at the end of the broadcast, and if you're interested, you can write. What we've looked at is both adding to HUD's list of criteria a vacancy rate measure to protect areas where it's going to be really difficult for families to move, particularly to higher opportunity areas, and Ed will talk about that issue some more, but also tweaking both items number 2 and number 3 in HUD's formula. If you change the rates, and if you, in number 3, if you modify HUD's ratio approach somewhat, you get actually very different results that we think are better targeted on the areas where small area fair market rents will make the most difference for families in terms of expanding access to opportunity, which is the goal, while being consistent with reaching about 1/4 to 1/3 of the vouchers now administered.
So as we will discuss more in depth in just a minute, this proposed rule could have adverse consequences for current voucher tenants who are unable or choose not to move from units where the small area fair market rents will be below their current fair market rent. The current regulations offering payment standard protections for families facing payment standard reductions until their second annual recertification of their income following the payment standard notification does remain in place, as do the exception payment standards for individuals with disabilities as a reasonable accommodation. Exception payment standards may also be available to account for rent variances within a zip code. Additionally, under the newly enacted Housing Opportunity through Modernization Act of 2016, all PHAs will have the option to not lower subsidy caps for tenants in place. HUD is requesting comment about possible additional tenant protection mechanisms, and Ed is going to discuss some of those areas now.
Thank you, Amber. This is Ed Gramlich from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. David, let me know if I'm not coming through clearly enough. He couldn't quite hear me clearly during our test run here. So
you sound fine.
Okay, great, thank you. So it's very important consideration is preventing harm to households who are currently relying on vouchers. So there's a potential problem here because in low-cost neighborhoods, the small area FMR is likely to be lower than the metro FMR that landlords are accustomed to having. This could result in a lower voucher payment standard, one that is potentially below current rents. If a landlord does not lower the rent when the payment standard declines, then residents will, within 1 or 2 years, have to pay more for their rent. They will have to pay the 30% of income that a resident currently pays in the voucher program, plus the difference between the contract rent and the lower payment standard. Residents consequently could be cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income for rent utilities. They might even be severely cost burdened, paying more than half of their income for rent and utilities. Even if a household really wants to stay in their home but considers moving to some other area in order just to get relief from being cost burdened, the question remains, are there affordable places for them to move to? And I'm having trouble advancing the slide here.
Just be sure to click in the PowerPoint window and then use your arrow key.
Okay. Here we go. Thank you. So, just a reminder, the primary purpose of the Small Area FMR program is to expand affordable housing choice for voucher holders by making it possible for them to use their voucher in more neighborhoods, particularly in areas of higher opportunity. But it's also important to consider that the choice that many voucher holders will have is likely to be to stay in their current homes and in their current neighborhoods. They might have important social ties, such as family, social, and cultural ties. Households with children may not want to switch schools. Elderly or disabled households might live close to doctors and other service providers that they rely upon. So some of the solutions to this problem include one that HUD includes in its reply in the proposed rule. They argue that PHAs may request an exception payment standard up to 120% of the fair market rent for all households within a zip code or a portion of a zip code, and/or they could seek higher payment standards as a reasonable accommodation for households with a member who has a disability. There are some problems with this, however. This relies on a PHA actually taking action, and lower rent areas may not qualify for exception payment standards based on rent data. Plus, requesting exception payment standards is not necessarily easy. It's kind of vague, although HUD could simplify that process. And also, HUD needs to provide some guidance in order to make reasonable accommodation requests easier. Another solution to consider is offered by HUD in the preamble to the proposed rule. HUD ponders increasing the amount of time that a household is held harmless by perhaps postponing the effect of a lower payment standard until a later income reexamination, to perhaps not the second but the third, the fourth, or maybe even the fifth income reexamination. The problem with this is that this simply delays the harmful economic impact on households whose incomes are not likely to be increasing accordingly in the third, fourth, or fifth year. A third solution, as noted earlier, a possible solution is to rely on HR 37, which allows PHAs to volunteer to not reduce a payment standard indefinitely when the FMR is reduced. Again, however, this depends on a PHA taking action. A fourth solution is to categorically exempt voucher households from any reduction in the payment standard for as long as a household remains in their existing home if they have a housing assistance payment contract on the date that the small area FMR is implemented. Now, some would argue against this option because the small area FMR concept must be cost neutral. That is, if many households currently assisted with vouchers do not want to move and their payment standard is not reduced, there's no cost savings. On the flip side, costs will go up as households who do want to move to higher opportunity areas have the value of their voucher increase to meet higher rents in those areas. However, hold harmless proponents countered that argument, saying that in the short run, and maybe even in the medium run, there's not likely to be a rush to move to higher opportunity areas. One, the cost of moving is high. You've got security deposits, first and last month's rent, and not to mention buying all that pizza and beer for people who help you to move. It'll also take time for PHAs to conduct outreach to landlords in areas of opportunity. There is not adequate mobility counseling at many PHAs to help households successfully move. In other words, to move to an area of opportunity and to be able to maintain their home in that area. It's also not clear that there is an adequate stock of available rental housing within small area FMR payment standards in areas of higher opportunity. And it is well known that there's outright discrimination by landlords towards people who have vouchers. And without source of income ordinances in most places, very few landlords participate. Now there's another angle to looking at the potential impact on current residents. That is looking at it from the perspective of continued landlord participation. Current voucher holders could also be harmed if landlords leave the voucher program due to reduced payment standards. Now in some markets, landlords might be able to get the rents they want without vouchers and without complying with voucher program requirements. And in some cases, the landlords might have relied on voucher payment standards to refinance their properties in order to make structural repairs. Now, in light of this potential problem, in the preamble, HUD ponders a streamlined exception payment standard for PHAs that request one. Again, that request one. This idea would be to phase in the small area FMR. For example, a payment standard of 130% of the fair market rent in the first year, decreasing to 120% the second year, and settling on 110% of the fair market rent in the third year and in all subsequent years. However, this again relies on PHAs taking action, and residents might still have cost burden. Some propose incrementally limiting how far small area FMRs can fall below the current metro fair market rents. For example, an idea would be setting small area FMRs no lower than 90% of the metro FMR in the first year, and then no lower than 80% the second year, and on and on. Question remains, what will it take to keep landlords from leaving? Is such a 10% increment slow enough to prevent landlords from exiting the program? Do we need to have a 5% increment in order to keep people in the program? And with that, I will turn it back over to Amber.
Thank you, Ed. Another aspect of the rule is that all PHAs operating in the 31 metro areas we discussed earlier, or based on a different set of metros based on updated data or the final criteria HUD adopts, will be required to use the small area FMRs. PHAs operating in areas not designated for small area FMRs may also benefit from using these small area FMRs. So PHAs may voluntarily use the small area FMRs in the administration of their voucher programs. And Phil is going to discuss some of the areas for comment on this PHA opt-in option.
Okay, thanks, Amber. And this is one of the most valuable elements of this rule, and we were concerned that it might not be in the proposed rule, but it is, basically allowing PHAs to opt in. I would say the two primary issues in this area are, first of all, what will it take to opt in? This is a pretty simple issue. The rule is slightly vague and suggests that perhaps HUD approval might be necessary for opting in. And I think we're all going to propose that if a PHA wants to opt in, it simply has to include the opting in to the small area FMR in its annual PHA plan as an amendment. The second major issue with the opt-in is whether the opting in to the small area FMR applies only within the jurisdiction of the public housing agency or in all areas where the PHA's vouchers are placed. For example, when a PHA ports out and places a voucher in a neighboring jurisdiction. We think it's pretty clear that the latter approach makes more sense, that a PHA placing a voucher in a nearby area should be able to use the higher small area FMR in that area. In our comments, though, we need to make we need to call for HUD to make this clear that that's the way it's going to operate. This approach would lead to different payment standards for different public housing agencies in the same town or neighborhood, of course, but that's really not that unusual across the country in places where there are overlapping public housing agency jurisdictions. And just to give a sense of how this plays out, if you're dealing with a county-wide public housing agency, for example, and the county-wide agency opts in, there's really no issue here because all of the areas within that county, within the jurisdiction, will be covered by the small area zip code FMRs. If, however, you're dealing with a highly fragmented region, say in the Northeast or Midwest, where you have a central city PHA with other PHAs surrounding the jurisdiction, then this issue would come up. Do the vouchers of the central city PHA placed in the higher opportunity suburban areas get to utilize the higher rent? And we think it's clear that it should, and that's going to be included in our comments. Barbara, do you have anything to add to this area?
No, so we agree with you that on everything you said. It was interesting that at the public meeting that HUD held about the rule, they seemed surprised when speakers urged that if it's voluntary, it ought to really be voluntary, and PHA shouldn't have to get HUD approval. And their rationale seemed to be that they needed to know, for various legitimate reasons, when the housing authority was opting in and what payment standards they were choosing based on the small area FMR. But HUD could meet that interest in a variety of ways that are simpler than having to plow through each PHA plan. So we agree it should be PHA opt-in through the PHA plan and a significant amendment to it, and separately provide whatever notice that HUD requires of the decisions they've made.
Thank you, Barbara. So another aspect of the rule, in addition to defining which areas will be designated to use small area FMRs, the rule will update the Federal Register to reflect the current data sources, which is the American Community Survey, and remove all references to the 50th percentile when setting payment standards. Under the proposed rule, the current 50th percentile small fair market rates designated for small area FMRs would transition to the small FMRs on the effective date of the small area designation. Current 50th percentile FMRs that are not designated for the small area FMRs will remain under the 50th percentile FMR until the end of the existing 3-year period prior to reverting to the standard 40th percentile FMR. Jurisdictions may still request HUD approval for payment standards based on the 50th percentile in accordance with the existing payment standard protection regulation. PHAs will still set payment standards at 90 to 110% of the small area FMR unless they receive HUD approval for an exception. The percentage of small area FMR can vary by zip code or smaller area. In response to concerns that zip code areas might still be too large to properly assess the real estate market, HUD is proposing to add flexibility to the small area FMR by amending the exception payment standard rules to ensure exception payment standards are available for areas smaller than a zip code. HUD is requesting comment on what other changes to the exception payment standard regulations may make the exceptions operate more efficiently. And Phil and Barbara are going to discuss the small area FMR calculations and the exception payment standards.
Okay, thanks, Amber. This is Phil again, and I want to make two sort of big points and then turn it over to Barbara perhaps for some of the more complicated details here. The first major point is that it's just really valuable to be able to adjust rents within a zip code. There are many zip codes, particularly in some inner suburban areas, for example, where there's a wide range of rents across a zip code. And it's crucial to have the ability to adjust by census tract above and below the basic range of 90 to 110%. To do this, however, HUD's going to need to make it a lot easier to request exception payment standards above the 110% range, and how they do that remains to be seen. The second major point I think we all need to make in our comment letters is that the small area FMRs, for a variety of reasons, may not be keeping up with the actual rent levels, especially in the higher opportunity areas. And for this reason, again, we need to have flexibility to increase the payment standards to 120 or 130% inside the small area FMR zip codes, if that's the case. We've seen this on the ground in certain places, and I think HUD needs to hear this from the field, that when you look at the small area FMRs, if that does not reflect the actual median or 40th percentile rents in your higher opportunity areas, HUD needs to hear this, and they need to be flexible in terms of responding to requests for adjustments. Barbara?
Thanks, Phil. So the details here are really technical, so I'm going to do just some high-level points, and those of you interested should ask me for our draft comments. The current exception payment standard requirements include both quantitative and qualitative factors, and both of those, both some of the quantitative measures and the qualitative showing that PHAs have to make to show that they need an exception payment standard, need to change for them to work effectively in an environment of zip code-based fair market rents rather than metro-wide. Just as one example, currently HUD cannot approve an exception payment standard that would cover more than half the population of a fair market rent area. Well, that may or may not have made sense when the FMR was for the whole metro. In a zip code, I think people thinking about their own locales can pretty easily think of entire zip codes that would need to be potentially higher than even the small area fair market rent would be, in part, perhaps as Phil mentioned, because rents are rising so quickly that the data that HUD uses to set them can't keep pace. So HUD needs to change that basically outmoded quantitative factor for exception payment standards to work throughout a zip code. And qualitatively, one of the most important issues is that HUD rules now require that a PHA show that families already have excessively high rent burdens because of the limits on the payment standard flexibility given what the fair market rent is. In the new world, whether the goal is to increase the payment standard to provide access to better neighborhoods or to increase it for some of the reasons that Ed mentioned to prevent families having excessively high rent burdens, that's a projection of rent burdens that will occur if families, A, were to move to a better neighborhood, or B, choose to remain in an area after the hold harmless period that applies under the current law. So it's essential that HUD change the qualitative concept, if it wants to use one at all, to a showing of prospective harm rather than of current harm. On the details of how HUD calculates small area FMRs, we point out that HUD could improve their accuracy in two major ways. One is by making adjustments based on the distribution of unit bedroom sizes within a particular zip code in relation to the metro area. HUD has made that tweak in the Dallas area, but doesn't do it generally. If HUD did that extra quantitative work, we think that the small area FMRs would be more adequate in to meet the actual rents in more areas. The second big quantitative change is related to how HUD projects forward from the available American Community Survey data to the midpoint of the year in which the small area FMRs will be in effect. By definition, the data are always out of date, even if they're the most recent available. HUD currently projects them forward based on national rent and utility inflation data. If HUD instead were to use regional factors in areas of the country where rents are escalating more rapidly, small area fair market rents would be more accurate. But again, if you care about these technical details, just request the center's draft comments from me.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So we just want to thank everyone for attending this briefing on HUD's proposed rule. And before we begin the Q&A section, we want to remind everyone to be on the lookout for an email following the webinar that will have a link to the survey where we're requesting feedback on both the webinar itself and also to determine which organizations might be interested in participating in a joint sign-on letter for the proposed comment, and also any other materials that might be helpful in the comment process. We will also distribute an email that includes all the panelist contact information so everyone can follow up as needed, and a one-pager with a link to both where you can submit proposed comments and also other helpful resources. And now we'll turn it back over to...
Sorry, those resources are actually available in the handout section of your toolbar, so if you go to handouts, you can download that one-pager.
Oh, great, thank you. And I think now we're turning it back over to Debbie and Ed for our Q&A section.
Thanks, Amber. And just to remind people that you can submit questions using the question section on your toolbar. You just type it in and send it in, and we will take a look at those. We have gotten a number, so we're going to start with those. And I guess I want to answer two questions that have come up so far. So one is about whether the slides will be available. And indeed they will. We'll send you, along with the survey, we'll send you a link to be able to a place where you can download the slides. And if Amber will scroll back up one, you'll see that in the slides there is a list of the email addresses for all of the presenters on today's webinar, so you can get in touch with people directly if you have specific questions. And we are recording today's webinar. We'll let you know whether we're able to make that recording available and where you'll be able to find it if we can. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ed to ask some of the questions that you all have sent in already, but remind you, please, questions, send them in now.
Thank you, Debbie. Right now we have 7 questions. I will articulate those as best I can, and then our esteemed panelists will respond to those. The first question is it illegal to discriminate against someone with a Housing Choice Voucher in the United States? Phil, there's a softball for you.
It is illegal to discriminate against families with vouchers in about a dozen states and many municipalities around the country. There's no federal law, of course, just barring voucher discrimination, but it is prohibited in a number of cities, counties, and states. And we have a list on our website, which we will include in the we'll include a link to that in the email that goes out after the session today.
Phil, I would like to add to that. If a property is assisted with a low-income housing tax credit program, the landlord has to accept a voucher. And if a property is also assisted with the home program or the brand new National Housing Trust Fund, those owners also have to accept someone.
And this is Barbara. Let me just also add that all too frequently, landlords' refusal to accept vouchers is a proxy for discrimination that is prohibited by federal law based on, for example, race or family status. And assistance might be available from local fair housing testing organizations to see whether even in jurisdictions that don't have prohibitions or properties that are not specially covered, whether landlords are acting illegally.
Thank you. Next question is, don't PHAs have an incentive to keep the payment standards low?
So this is Barbara. Not necessarily is the short answer. So if the payment standard is lower, the dollars that an agency gets from HUD will stretch further than they could potentially serve more families, which they might care about, and serving more families also earns them additional administrative fees. But if the payment standard is too low, as I tried to point out in the example at the beginning of the webinar, some families are going to be prohibited from using their vouchers because they won't be able to find a unit that would cost less than 40% of their total income, which is the cap on what they're allowed to pay, or even if they can find some units, they're going to be able to find fewer, and they might not succeed in leasing up within the search time allowed. And in that case, not only is that bad for the family, but the housing authority will have spent a lot of administrative time issuing a voucher to a family that doesn't succeed in using it. They get no payment from HUD for those expenses because they only get paid for vouchers that lease. So housing authorities have actually an incentive to hit the sweet spot where payment standards are high enough for families to be able to use their vouchers successfully and not so high as to potentially overpay and as a result serve fewer families. We also, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule provides a new incentive and an important one for housing authorities to care about whether they are designing their payment standards in a way that actually helps families live outside racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and to access low poverty, non-segregated areas. The incentives are actually more complicated than people commonly think, and then some housing authorities may even be thinking about.
This is Ed. I kind of have maybe a question of my own related to this, because in HUD's preamble to the proposed rule, and I think in last spring and summer's advance notice, there was an indication that in quite a few public housing authorities, it would appear that they were not doing adequate rent reasonableness in low cost areas, and consequently landlords were getting overly subsidized. And so I guess to my mind, the question arises is some PHAs may not be even considering incentives to keep payment standards low. And hearing no response from Phil or Barbara, I will move on to the next question.
Well, I think, but I'll respond briefly. I think there's some evidence of overpayment in some places, Ed, but I think the bigger problem that was flagged by HUD is the incentives that the current system creates, both for families and for landlords. For landlords to aggressively recruit tenants into higher poverty neighborhoods, and also for tenants to get more bang for their buck, so to speak, to get a larger unit, for example, in a poorer neighborhood, and to not really weigh the neighborhood and school quality as high as a result. So I think both factors were included by HUD in the advance notice.
Thanks, Phil. That's helpful for me anyway. Third question, when could a PHA opt in? Is there a deadline?
So this is Barbara. So first there has to be a final rule, and then we'll see what the rule says. That said, if a housing authority is interested in the potential that small area FMRs would provide in their jurisdiction, they currently can request exception payment standards based on HUD small area fair market rent. So while the full flexibility that we talked about in the broadcast isn't to actually adopt small area FMRs is not available until HUD finalizes the rule, housing authorities can accomplish somewhat similar results, not as good, but close, by relying on the small area FMRs to request exception payment standards.
Thank you. So a related question is, do we, the Royal We, have any inclinations about which PHAs might actually be wanting to opt in? Get out your crystal balls.
I think a lot of that may have to do with local advocacy and efforts to press your PHA to do that. I think this is also part of the affirmatively furthering fair housing discussion that's going to be happening for a lot of PHAs starting in about a year. And I think there's going to be ample space in those discussions and the community engagement part of the AFFH rule to bring this up with the PHA and to make it a priority.
Thank you. The fifth question is kind of probably in relation to my criticisms or concerns about PHAs having to take action in order to seek exception payment standards or to implement the new provision of HR 3700. So the question is, how often could a PHA take actions if it so chose?
That's a really important question. This is Barbara. And HUD's practice in the past has been uneven about how frequently they require agencies to renew a request for exception payment standards or to increase the exception payment standards consistently with increases in the underlying FMRs. And we think that's an important issue also for people to submit comments on, and that we are recommending that agencies not be required to resubmit on anything close to an annual basis. Maybe 5 years would be a reasonable time period, and that annually exceptions should be automatically increased by HUD consistent with the increase in the underlying fair market rent, small area or otherwise.
Okay, the next question, I wish I could see Phil and Barbara's eyes so that we wouldn't have the dead air. The next question I'm going to actually have Debbie read out because it's long, but it's well worded and full of, I think, appropriate nuance.
And actually, before I do that, this is Debbie, I just want to remind people again that if you have questions, you should please submit them through the question box on your toolbar. And also to point out that there are now 2 handouts. So David has very kindly uploaded for us the list from the PRAC website of the places where source of income discrimination is banned around the country, in addition to the handout that we mentioned earlier with some of the resources that will give you background information about the small area fair market rents and this rule. So the question that we got is really more of a comment, and I wanted to put it out there for any of you to comment on. And it's really a comment about the language that we use to describe the kinds of neighborhoods, both where voucher holders may be living now and where we want to make sure that they have opportunities to live if they would choose those. And it's about whether the term better neighborhoods, or rather it's a statement that in this person's view, the term better neighborhoods seems disparaging and could be perceived as actually discriminatory against neighborhoods of color, and that on the flip side, the term high opportunity undervalues the opportunities and the resources that are available in all communities. So I want to see if any of you wanted to just comment on that comment.
I think that's a good comment. I think we should be careful of our language, but at the same time, we need to recognize the very powerful research on particularly the impact on young children of being in really concentrated poverty, disinvested neighborhoods. You know, the whole spirit of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is both to promote reinvestment and improvement in high poverty segregated neighborhoods, also to give families the opportunity to move to other kinds of neighborhoods, including low poverty neighborhoods with you know, low poverty schools, which have been you know, basically proven to provide better educational outcomes for low-income kids. So I think we need to both, you know, recognize some of the racial overtones in our rhetoric, but also face up to the fact that we've, you know, created really separate and unequal neighborhoods in our metro areas, and that this, one of the purposes of this rule is to help at least families that have the privilege of owning federal housing vouchers the opportunity to have more choice about where they move.
This is Barbara. I agree with what Phil said, and if my language was sloppy, I apologize. And to some extent, I think the word better is shorthand for what the market decides is better, which is based on more demand, higher rents. That isn't the sole measure of opportunity for any family, but the vital thing is that vouchers should achieve their core purpose, which is to give families choice of where to live. And the mounting evidence is, unfortunately, that while they succeed better than HUD's other programs at doing that, they don't come close to fulfilling their potential. And as Phil noted, we're learning more and more about why, in addition to the basic idea that families ought to have a choice about where to live, that the outcomes really matter for those families and for society as a whole.
This is Debbie. I would just add as well that, you know, to some extent we're a little bit constrained by the terminology that HUD uses. So when you're talking about HUD's terminology, you tend to use HUD's terminology. But I think it's a really important point to remember that we need to acknowledge that, neighborhoods, regardless of their income level or how segregated they are, often have really strong assets that don't necessarily get captured by the kind of analysis or discussion that we're having here, and it's important to acknowledge those, as well as all the other things that you all have said in response. Okay, Ed has another question, I think, to pose.
Yes, another question. This one always causes me to run to my regs to reread the total tenant payment requirements, but I don't have those handy, so I'm going to rely on Barbara. The term adjusted income, does that when figuring out how much a household pays, is that adjusted income? Is it after-tax income? How is that determined?
So adjusted income is based on HUD regulations that specify what kinds of, first specify what counts as income. So for example, an earned income tax credit payment not count as income. And then it also specifies what counts as a deduction. So withholding from a paycheck for Social Security and Medicare does not count as a deduction. So in other words, the concept of adjusted income has nothing to do with after-tax income in either direction, higher or lower. It primarily includes deductions for dependents, the number of dependents in a household, and for elderly and disabled people, it can include other deductions for medical or handicapped assistance expenses. There are some other deductions. Oh, and there's also a deduction for child care expenses to enable a parent of a kid under 13 to work or sometimes to go to school. Those are the major ones.
Thank you.
Okay, we have several other questions here, one of which is there any way to address the credit challenges that voucher holders have that might exclude them from access to higher cost rental area or rental markets?
Bill, do you want to answer that? I take it that that's about credit repair or discrimination based on credit scores.
That's how I'd
Yeah.
interpret it.
I mean, I can't really, it's a serious problem, and I know that some of the areas where they have housing mobility counseling work on that with tenants as they're getting ready to search for housing and look for opportunities in higher cost areas where the barriers are higher, barriers to entry are higher. I think in the absence of that kind of housing mobility program, it's going to be hard to, but doing credit repair is crucial sometimes in getting access to higher opportunity areas. And similarly, having access to security deposit assistance programs is often another aspect of, another barrier to entry that people, that some of the better mobility programs offer to tenants.
Great, thanks. The next question is with an acknowledgement that, Barbara, you suggested that the answer to this might be complicated, but whether the small area fair market rents could help us address displacement of families of color and low-income families from gentrifying neighborhoods?
It would be great if they did. I think it probably depends how the rents in that neighborhood compare to the metro level rents. So in some cases, displacement is happening in places where rents are rising rapidly, but those rents are still below the metro average. And in that case, small area FMRs are not likely to help in the short run, at least, because they could lead to lower fair market rents rather than higher. But on the other hand, if that neighborhood is one that, for whatever reasons, has higher rents generally than the metro area, small area fair market rents could be a very useful tool. That said, it's really important to remember that in an area, particularly where landlords are free to decide whether to accept vouchers or not, rapid gentrification and rent increases in an area is often not hospitable to voucher holders being able to remain. And I think it's going to be important for housing authorities and communities to be looking to how they can utilize project-based vouchers to lock in longer-term affordability for voucher holders. And there's a lot of new flexibility for use of project-based vouchers in the newly approved bill that you heard us mention, H.R. 3700. And there's also an aspect of the proposed rule related to use of small area fair market rents in project-based voucher development that could be important. And again, if you're interested in those issues, let me know.
Thank you, Barbara. Anybody else want to comment on that? So here's a somewhat related question, and that's whether the change in the median rent is taken into account in determining the small area fair market rent. This person notes that that's a good measure of where rents are going, and that if the small area FMR lags in historically lower rent areas that are targets for redevelopment efforts, that it won't be able to keep pace with new units, even in the neighborhoods where the voucher holders currently reside. So go ahead.
So I think the answer to the question is yes, but I'm honestly not certain.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay. Then I think this may be the last question. So if you still have a question and you haven't sent it in, please do so now so we can get to it before we wrap. This question is whether the panelists have any thoughts or recommendations about how HUD could address the existence of race and source of income discrimination against voucher holders that will undermine the efficacy of this program in ending racial and income segregation, and whether you think it's helpful for local fair housing testing organizations to bring this question up in their comments on the rule. Any thoughts on that one?
I think it's a great question, Debbie, and I think fair housing groups, and we all should speak up on that point. And you know, this rule is coming out of the public housing division of HUD. It's not coming out of the fair housing division of HUD, but it really is a fair housing rule. And I think you know, getting the fair housing division thinking about this new rule change in the voucher program and how they can utilize their network of FIP agencies, for example, to monitor the implementation and to make sure that you know, people are you know, not being discriminated against, people are getting access to these higher rent areas. I think that would be a great alignment of HUD efforts. I think part of that is HUD recognizing that voucher discrimination, especially in metro areas, is often a proxy for race discrimination or is aligned with race discrimination, and that agencies that the HUD Fair Housing Office is funding through the FIP program perhaps should be empowered as part of their FIP grant to test for source of income discrimination in those places where it's prohibited. particularly making sure that low-income housing tax credit properties, for example, are not discriminating against voucher families.
Great, thank you, Phil. Anyone else want to comment on that one? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. So before we wrap, I want to do a couple things. I want to remind you to please download the handouts because I think you'll find them helpful. I want to remind you to look out for the email that you'll get with the link to the survey and a link to the PowerPoint slides. I want to remind you all to please submit comments because it's really important whether you're in one of the cities that looks like it's going to be on the mandatory list for using the new rule, or whether you're in a city where you think it could be helpful, but it would require your PHA to opt in. It's really important for HUD to have all of our feedback about what's good about this rule and what needs to be strengthened in order to make it work better in the markets that we all live in. So please submit comments, and if you are interested in signing on to a joint comment letter, please let us know through that question on the survey that you'll get. I want to thank all of the presenters who did a fabulous job of answering your questions. Thank you all for your patience, participation, and your good questions. And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you all.